Flagellant. Chapter 1. Baptism. He was a listless shade of the city, indifferent to his penury. With his skeletal build and bleeding gums, he looked an easy target for a pair of drunks seeking an outlet for their frustrations. The blows rained down, a tooth cracked, and a feverish crimson eclipsed his vision. In pain, there was power. He rose above his panting assailants and, reveling in the marks of their sin, forgave them their trespasses. Chapter 2. In Service of the Divine. Drawn to the somber depths of the church's oubliettes, he pledged his life to the clergy. There he inflicted death by slow, delicious degrees, each crack of the lash an honor, a gift, a morbid sacrament. But his zeal proved too ardent, his brethren too timid. They cast him out, rendered him once more onto the streets. Chapter 3. More. He roved out in search of torment, consuming the sin of any who would purge their misdeeds upon his body. Each wound fueled his fervor, a rapture only found in baptism by the lash. Drunk on his bloody intinctions, manic with the need for some elusive apotheosis, he gouged at himself without mercy. As blood poured from his rended flesh, his consciousness faltered, and the thundering hoofbeats of death rang violent in his ears. Chapter 4. Death's Door. Her scythe promised numbing obliviation, a premature end to his sacred journey of sensation. Gleaned from the world's gruesome delights, his power was enough to defy death herself. Chapter 5. Behold the man. Once more he wandered, ravenous for fresh suffering and delighting in its novelty and excess. Offering himself to blade and talon alike, he became an icon writ in flesh, a living prayer to whatever gods would turn an ear. Undying, he savored his delicious declension, an eternity of pain and wrath, heaven on earth. Grave Robber. Chapter 1. Luxury's Lap. Born into money and married into more, she spent her days on horseback and her evenings in the ballroom. She was the object of her husband's boorish lust and drunken temper, placating his worst tendencies with a veneer of gracious deference, all the while indulging murderous fantasies of freedom and the fortune that would soon be hers. Chapter 2. Nightcap. Night after night of disrespect and abuse, enough was enough. She listened, smirking, as his empty apologies came in desperate, choking gags. Chapter 3. Embarrassment of riches. Years of decadence and financial mismanagement had left the estate in staggering debt. Humiliated and facing eviction, she wandered the empty halls, hurling inebriated indignities at the portrait of the deceased, whose hand had rested so possessively upon her shoulder. A gleam of gold on that painted paw reminded her that his rings were unaccounted for, and must have been buried with him. Chapter 4. Filthy Rich. To preserve her social standing, she would pilfer the rings from his fingers, the gold from his teeth. She was awash in exhilaration, the glint in her eyes outshining the fistful of ill-gotten gains. Chapter 5. The Afterparty. Armed officials dispatched to oversee the eviction were shocked to find the front doors listlessly ajar. The lavish carpets were lousy with dirt and leaves. A heap of heirlooms gleamed on the ballroom floor, rings and brooches in a careless pile. The lady of the manor, however, was nowhere to be found. Hellion. Chapter 1. The Eve of Glory. She was young to join the war band, but any who challenged her readiness were met with clenched fists and violent indignation. Having bloodied the last of her detractors, the matter was considered finally settled. On the eve of battle, she joined her clanmates in a raucous celebration, her stein and her spirits overflowing with abundance. Chapter 2. The Brave. She was the tip of the spear, poised to sunder the enemy line, to live forever in the songs of her people. Her entire life spent in preparation, but when it mattered most, she had failed. Chapter 3. Night in the Woods. As the advancing army moved on, she huddled tightly in the tree's clammy roots, hoping to be somehow swallowed up into the earth. At dawn, she woke tormented by the exuberant cries of carrion crows, come to feast upon the corpses of her kin. When at last she stirred, the scavengers took flight, repulsed by the sight of this undeserving revenant. Chapter 4. Shame and Exile. She had shunned a warrior's death, and her cowardice would be impugned. They cast her out, an exile, unwelcome and unsung. Chapter 5. The Great Emptyness. Alone and untethered, she wandered the countryside, fighting for sport and soaking her wounds in wine. She sought death at every turn, desperate for a second chance to prove her mettle. But it seemed even that terrible wraith had forsaken her. Her isolation was absolute, her shame barely concealed by a fragile facade of fearlessness. Highwayman. Chapter 1. Freedom. A prison riot. A fleeting chance to escape incarceration. He would be a fugitive, a hunted man, but a free one nonetheless. Chapter 2. Laying low. Harried by a pursuing garrison, he took refuge in the fetid canals of the city. Concealment took its toll, and soon he began to see himself in the furtive, scurrying pests that formed an unfortunate portion of his meager diet. Freedom, once so fondly imagined, had become a vortex of degradation. Chapter 3. One last job. He was sick and starving, and in desperation offered his expertise to an unscrupulous malefactor. Shackled once more to an unsavory task by an advance of gold, he lined his belly, girded himself, and prepared for one final heist. Chapter 4. Highway Robbery. The stagecoach arrived, and he set himself to the business of bloodshed and robbery. He fulfilled his obligations with exceptional lethality, but his grim satisfaction would prove short-lived. Chapter 5. Shackled. The lifeless bodies of a woman and child, horribly mutilated by errant gunfire, stared spectrally through the remnants of the coach door. Arrested by the ghoulish sight, he felt the cold chains of remorse tighten around his heart. Guilt was a pursuer he could never outrun, a prison he would never escape. Jester. Chapter 1. Some strange melody. He was a layabout without aspiration or purpose, content to loiter on street corners, languidly busking for passers-by. Roughly ushered from the bustling commercial blocks, he wandered the forgotten corners of the city. An intoxicating melody drifted over a nearby cemetery wall, and he stumbled deliriously amongst the tombstones in search of the performer. Chapter 2. Music of the Night. He could learn this unearthly hymn and claim it as his own. Ambition, so long dormant within him, had been roused. He delighted in fantasies of fame, renown, and respect. Chapter 3. Play to the crowd. When word of his uncommon talent reached the palace, he was summoned to entertain king and court. Anticipating an historic performance and enthused adulation, he was stunned to find himself instead the object of their debased ridicule. While his noble audience dined drunkenly, he was mocked, tortured, and subjected to an obscene array of dangerous and decadent humiliations. Chapter 4. A Dark Song. He unleashed his resentment upon instrument and crowd, playing the demoniac melody with unrestrained fury. This was the song of the dead, and it had exacted a fitting tribute. Chapter 5. Finale. Bowing low, he basked in the echoing applause of dripping blood. The scene of wholesale dismemberment drove him to fits of mirthless hysterics. He was laughing still as he placed the blade against his own hand, severing his connection to whatever twisted talent he had so fleetingly enjoyed. Aimlessly he drifted from the hall, humming broken bars of a discordant melody he could not quite remember. Leper. Chapter 1. Shun them not. Despite the protestations of his royal advisors, he would visit with the sick and dying, providing them what comfort he could. The ailing and infirm were far less repulsive to him than the venomous whispers of his scoffing entourage. Chapter 2. Infection. Early signs could be ignored or concealed, but soon the reality was inescapable, whether by some affliction of lineage or by direct transmission. Symptoms of incurable disease began to openly manifest themselves. Racked with pain, he summoned doctors and aides from the farthest reaches of his lands, all of whom concluded the worst. The king was dying. Chapter 3. Treason. Sedition like any illness, spreads slowly. Rotten with a cynical opportunism born of long-standing entitlement, the scheming circle of advisors drafted mutinous plans. Though bedridden, he had long since divined their intent and feared the disastrous results of their would-be rule. Summoning his blacksmith and his strength, he hoisted his blade and rose to meet the coming threat. Chapter 4. The Purge. He had shown his compassion. Now he would show his fury. His blade had broken, but so too the treasonous plot. Chapter 5. A beautiful view. Satisfied that the spirit of his benevolent tenure would endure, he abdicated the throne. People gathered at windows and along the roads, weeping. Some threw petals at his feet, while others watched in reverent stoicism. As he walked beyond the city gates, he marveled at the beauty of the world and was grateful for his many blessings. Man-at-Arms. Chapter 1. A premature promotion. The politics of a military career are perhaps as treacherous as war itself. Though untested in combat, his acumen for advancement was unmatched. Through a dubious campaign of influence and intimidation, he had at last claimed a coveted command, and was eager to bask in the glory of the victories that were sure to come. Chapter 2. A Leader of Men. Behold the conquering general, marching his men to victory. A rout, a massacre, a complete and total failure of command. Chapter 3. One eye open. Every night, the men of his regiment would interrupt his fitful convalescence. Mutilated and maimed, the spectral garrison clawed at his bed covers, whispering hateful truths in his ears. The exhausted attendants in the field hospital would wake to the sound of panicked screaming and inglorious sobs. It was not the war that had taken his eye. It was pride. Chapter 4. Ghosts of the Past. Demoted and disgraced, he returned to the battlefield, ready to endure the wrath of his regiment and grant them some small peace. At last, he would sleep undisturbed, and perhaps find some comfort in that murky abyss of dreamless wonder. Chapter 5. In the Trenches. He resolved to spend his remaining years seeking atonement in the trenches of bloody battlefields the world over. For him, there could be no respite from the horrors of war, and when at last he was struck down, he would die alone and unremembered. Surely, he deserved no better. Occultist. Chapter 1. The Ritual. On certain portentous evenings carefully selected for their astrological potency, he would gather his devotees around the ancient onyx table, and joining hands with them, would send his spirit out into the void. Safely tethered by their vital energies, he was free to wander the outer spheres in search of some dark communion and impossible power. Chapter 2. A Door in the Desert. He found himself in a vast expanse of windswept dunes. Ahead, the stone spires of a pyramidal temple called down jagged bolts from a rolling, angry sky. Undaunted, he crossed the threshold of the towering aperture, settled himself upon the central dais, and prepared for the coming sacrifice. Chapter 3. Some parts must die. Terrible though it was, he would pay the price for power. The emptiness in him called out across boundless gulfs of unknown space, for nature abhors a vacuum. Chapter 4. The Guest. Drawing vitality from the assembled mediums, he would hold fast against the thing and harness a portion of its power. Imbued with strange currents of infernal origin, his apotheosis was complete. Chapter 5. An eternal flame. Emerging from his trance, he met the charred, steaming corpses of his acolytes with a shudder. He could sense the eldritch entity stalking the edges of his consciousness, probing for weaknesses. He had become a beacon, a conduit to unknown regions, and would be assailed by those blasphemous forces all the rest of his days. Plague Doctor. Chapter 1. The Good Student. Brilliant and bold, her unconventional theories created nothing short of a scandal in her 4th year. The mocking whispers and scornful glares of her peers and professors had an ironically invigorating effect upon her extracurricular experiments. The mysteries of the human body, of life and death itself, hovered just beyond her scalpel's reach. If only she could acquire a corpse of sufficient freshness. Chapter 2. Head of the class. Her professor was a relic, hacking and wheezing his way through a hopelessly conventional curriculum. She delighted in the combative debate, and behind her bookish glasses, reveled in their outrage and confusion. Chapter 3. Extra credit. By the 2nd semester, her research was at a critical point, and regular supply raids of the university laboratories had become necessary. During one such expedition, she stumbled upon her professor, awkwardly slumped over his podium, a bloody kerchief on the floor. Here, then, was her ideal cadaver, her long-awaited opportunity, and she would not waste it. Chapter 4. Failing grade. Success. Vindication. The human machine restored to action. The shrieking and wailing was horrible, but the silence that followed was even worse. Chapter 5. Do no harm. Disposal of the body was a procedural affair. A carboy of acid would dissolve the thing and no evidence would remain. In the weeks that followed, however, she found herself unable to focus, sitting motionless at her desk, paralyzed by the ceaseless wailing that reverberated in her mind. Runaway. Chapter 1. The Pigs of St. Martha's. Her pious caretakers had marked her for the last time. Tonight, she would escape their cruelty at last. She ran blindly into the rain, the squeals of the pursuing sisters lost in the howling wind. Chapter 2. beloved. Good fortune is a rare and wondrous thing. She straggled from place to place, drenched and hungry, until a kindly woodsman and his wife happened upon her. Childless themselves, they welcomed her into their home, where she warmed herself in the glow of their hearth and hearts. Chapter 3. Drawn to the Flame. She would stay up long into the night, tending the fire. Captivated by its shifting hues, she thrilled to the eerie dance of spark and ember, running her fingers absent-mindedly over the scars that patterned her arm. The hearthlight seemed somehow alive, and in these private moments, she yearned to reach out and be touched once again by its searing embrace. Chapter 4. Burnt Offering. An accident, but surely there was time to contain the flames. The walls were alight. There was no stopping it now. Chapter 5. Ashes. She stood in the center of the inferno, transfixed by its swirling kaleidoscopic beauty. Her rapturous fixation was cut short by a heavy beam falling from the ceiling, blocking the door. Panicked, she dove headlong through a window as the cabin bloomed into a pyre. Heaped upon the wet grass, she heard the screams of her adoptive parents, trapped and burning in their bedroom. Vestal. Chapter 1. Want not. Together with her sisters, she tended the Order's sacred flame in pious humility. The Abbey's austere arches and sanctified masonry afforded her a life of sheltered privilege that few beyond the walls could imagine. Discipline was paramount, and when forbidden desires would seek to distract her from monastic toil, she smothered them. Reluctantly. Chapter 2. A momentary lapse. She was a paragon of duty and virtue, but reminders of her deprivation were everywhere. Surely she deserved some indulgence for her labors. Immersed in her reverie, she started violently at the piercing admonitions of the furious abbot. Chapter 3. No God but Men. Her terrified wails rang off the transepts as the abbot dragged her to the oubliette. As a deterrent to the congregation, her punishment would be more than commensurate with her blasphemy. Locked interminably in the festering dark, she awaited retribution from the divine, while suffering the mortal tortures of its enraged servants. Chapter 4. Divine Intervention. Vindication. A golden ray beamed affirmation into the stagnant blackness of the dungeon. No divine punishment awaited her. It was her captors who had strayed from the light. Radiant with revelation, she stormed the stairs to the cloisters. Chapter 5. Wrath. Eager to share her emancipation with her convent, she rushed headlong toward the dormitory, but where the chamber door once stood, she was met instead by a sheer wall of fresh masonry. Her cries of jubilation died in her throat. From behind the drying mortar and sturdy stone, there came a feeble scratching. Then her sister's last hideous gasps. The price of her wantonness would not be measured solely in blows from the flail.